Episode 1, The Arrival. It was an old, forgotten town. Ravenswood, nestled between thick, ever-present woods and the wind-swept hills. The town felt isolated, like it had been forgotten by time itself. The light was dim here, as though the sun had little strength to break through the endless clouds that hovered above. The houses, too, seemed weary and weather-beaten, their foundations cracked, their paint peeling, as if they had borne the weight of countless untold stories. Anna stepped off the bus, her boots crunching on the gravel as the doors slammed shut behind her. She had been following the strange signals for weeks, piecing together cryptic messages, and chasing leads from old reports. But this town, this place, felt like the culmination of everything. It was here she would find the answers. Or, at the very least, understand the darkness that had been haunting her dreams. She adjusted the strap of her worn backpack, her journal tucked carefully inside. A cold wind swept through the narrow streets, tugging at her coat, and she could almost hear a voice whispering from the shadows. "Welcome," it seemed to say. "You've come at last." The radio tower. The first thing Anna noticed was a tower. It stood on the outskirts of Ravenswood, just past the cemetery, looming like a forgotten relic of the past. Its metal frame, once bright and bold, had been tarnished by years of neglect. It was tall, rising above the town like a silent sentinel, its rusting antennas stretching into the sky. The locals whispered about it. "Don't go near it," they said. "Stay away from the tower," others warned, their faces pale, eyes filled with a dread Anna couldn't quite place. But for Anna, the tower was calling her. It was her destination. She had to see it. The town's whispers only deepened her resolve. The town's secrets. She checked into the only inn in town, a creaky building with creaking floors and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. The old innkeeper, a thin, wiry man named Charles, had barely looked up when she entered, his eyes glued to the newspaper in front of him. "You're the reporter?" he asked gruffly, his voice low and raspy. "Yes," Anna replied, handing him a few bills. "Just passing through." He grunted and handed her a rusty key, not bothering to make eye contact. "Be careful in this town. Some stories you don't want to uncover." Anna gave a small nod, taking the key from him, but the words lingered in her mind. Some stories you don't want to uncover. The first night, the room was small, nothing more than a bed, a table, and a single window that faced out into the heart of Ravenswood. The town was already shrouded in shadows, the fading light barely piercing the thick fog that rolled through the streets. As night fell, Anna unpacked her bag and settled in. Her notebook lay open on the bed, filled with scribbled notes from her earlier investigations. The signal, the radio transmission that had been reported for years. She had traced its origin to this very town, but nothing seemed to connect the dots. There was a heavy silence in the air, one that felt oppressive, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards, the gust of wind pushing against the old windows. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her friend back home. "Anna, be careful. The signal you're tracking, it's not just a broadcast. It's a warning." Anna stared at the message for a long moment. The weight of the words settled on her chest like a stone. She had heard rumors of strange occurrences in Ravenswood, disappearances, inexplicable events, the occasional unsolved death. But a warning? What was that supposed to mean? The first signal. Anna's thoughts were interrupted by a strange sound, a low hum coming from a window. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the hum grew louder, becoming a constant, almost rhythmic thrum. It was as if the town itself was vibrating. She quickly grabbed a recorder, eager to capture the sound. But as she lifted it, the signal shifted. It wasn't a radio transmission this time. It was something else. A voice. It was faint at first, indistinct, but slowly it became clearer. "Come closer. It's waiting, you're not alone." Anna's heart pounded in her chest. The voice was cold, distant, yet full of a terrifying familiarity. She had to get to the source of this. It was as though the town had been speaking directly to her. The search for the truth. The next day, Anna set out for the radio tower, her nerves frayed but her curiosity stronger than ever. She could feel the eyes of the town on her as she passed by, the whispers growing louder. No one dared follow her, yet she felt as though the whole town was watching. The radio tower was closer than she had anticipated. It stood in a clearing, surrounded by thick trees. As she walked up to it, the air grew heavier. She could hear the hum again, louder now, as though it was coming from the very earth beneath her feet. She reached the base of the tower, looking up at its rusting metal frame. It felt wrong. The ground around the tower was unnaturally cold, even though the weather had been mild. Anna reached out, touching the cold metal. The hum grew louder, vibrating beneath her fingertips. Suddenly, the radio tower shuddered, and for a split second, Anna thought she saw something move in the shadows of the trees. Something huge and dark. The voice returned, clearer this time. "You shouldn't have come." The first encounter. Anna stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The world seemed to tilt, as though she were no longer standing on solid ground. The shadows around her seemed to shift, moving in ways that were impossible, as though the darkness itself was alive. She turned to leave, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to hold her in place. Something was pulling her in, drawing her closer to the tower, to the unknown, the signal, the voice, the dark force behind it all. It was here, and it wanted something from her. Something more than just her curiosity. Episode 2, Whispers in the Walls. The echoes grow louder. Anna stood still beneath the decaying radio tower, the strange humming sound pulsing around her, vibrating through her bones. Her fingers tingled from the cold metal she had touched earlier. The air felt thick, as though it were pressing it on her from every side. The whisper of the wind, the rustling of leaves, all seemed muted by something darker, something far more sinister. And then there was again a voice, so faint at first that it seemed to come from the farthest reaches of her mind, only for it to grow stronger, closer, until it felt as though the voice was standing right beside her, whispering into her ear. "Come closer, it's waiting for you." The words slithered into her thoughts, cold and sharp, echoing through the stillness. Her heart raced, her breath shallow, as she glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone, emerging from the woods. But the clearing was empty. No figure stood in the shadows, no movement in the trees. Her body froze, caught between the urge to run and the compulsion to investigate. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her mind, curious, relentless, drove her forward. Taking a shaky breath, Anna stepped closer to the tower. The sound grew louder, almost deafening. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a distorted noise, like static over broken radio, warping in and out. But what struck her most was the eerie feeling that the ground beneath her was shifting, changing. She felt as though she were no longer standing on solid earth, but on something alive. The walls speak. The next morning, Anna could not shake the image of the tower from her mind. The voice, the whisper, it lingered like a cloud hanging over her thoughts, refusing to dissipate. Her hotel room felt smaller, more suffocating, the walls pressing in with every passing hour. Even the silence felt unnatural, thick and oppressive, as if it were alive, listening, waiting. The small town of Ravenswood was quiet when she ventured out, the morning mist clinging to the narrow streets. The same oppressive silence hung in the air. She passed by the townspeople, who seemed to stare at her with strange, unblinking eyes. Their faces held secrets they were too terrified to share. She had to find out what was going on. Something in the town was wrong. Something dark was pulling at the edges of her reality. As she walked, Anna noticed an old, abandoned house on the edge of town. It stood apart from the rest of the buildings, its windows shattered, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. She could feel the pull, an invisible force, a whispering call, drawing her toward it. It was the same feeling she had gotten when she first arrived in Ravenswood. The town itself seemed to call to her, the house of echoes. The door creaked loudly as Anna pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty space. Dust floated in the air like a thick veil, and the smell of mold and decay permeated the room. The walls, once painted a soft cream, were now peeling and darkened by years of neglect. Faint scratches marred the floorboards, as if something or someone had dragged across the wood in desperation. The house was silent, But Anna could feel the weight of its history. It was a place where the past had never truly let go. A place where memories lingered, hanging in the air like shadows. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on an old fireplace at the far side. But something caught her attention, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. She froze, her pulse quickening. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from within the walls. Anna stepped forward, drawn to the sound. She placed her ear against the cold, damp surface of the wall, her breath catching her throat as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. And then, just as quickly, it stopped, the shadow behind the wall. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stepped back from the wall, her mind racing with questions. The scratching, what was it? Had someone been trapped inside the walls? Was someone still there? Anna's hand trembled as she reached for her phone to record the eerie silence, her fingers brushing against the cold wall one more time before she turned to leave. That's when she saw it. A shadow. It moved, swift and unnatural, crawling from the corner of the room, slithering against the floor of the walls, as though it were alive. It was blacker than the shadows around it, an absence of light, pulling at her from the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, but it was gone. Gone. Anna stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. What was that shadow? What was lurking behind the walls of this house? The voice returns. She could hear it again, faint at first, but growing stronger. It's already here. The voice returned, this time colder, more threatening, as though speaking directly into her mind. Anna pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but only grew louder, more insistent. She turned, half running, half walking back to the door. But as she reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, throwing her against the wall. She cried out, her body colliding with the cold, rough surface of the stone. And then, as though the room itself were closing in on her, she heard something that made her freeze in terror. A voice, not from the walls, not from the shadows, but from the other side of the door. You shouldn't have come here. Episode 3. The Forgotten Echoes. The Descent into Darkness. The following morning, Sarah woke to the muffled sound of rain pattering against the window. The cold, gray skies outside reflected the unease that had settled within her since last night. The whispering shadows, the voice calling out to her. It was all becoming too real. She tried to shake off the strange sense of dread that clung to her like a heavy fog. But she knew the only way to get answers was to continue down this dark path. Ravenswood had secrets, and they weren't just the whispers of the townspeople. No, they were the very fabric of this place, woven into the walls, the very ground beneath her feet. She stood from her bed, her feet cold against the floorboards, and walked to the window, her fingers brushing the curtain aside. The town stretched before her, small and suffocating, the ancient houses lined up like forgotten sentinels. Even now, she could feel the tension in the air, an invisible force that seemed to press against her chest, suffocating her with every breath. The message in the mirror. As she prepared to leave her room, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. For a moment, she froze. The reflection staring back at her was different. Her eyes were darker, shadows beneath them deeper. A faint, unsettling distortion flickered across the glass. She leaned closer, her breath fogging up the mirror. The image of herself seemed to ripple, as if something was pushing against it, trying to escape. Sarah jerked away, heart racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. No, it wasn't possible. There was no way, but the unsettling thought lingered. The mirror had shown her something hidden. As she took a step back from the mirror, she noticed something odd. A small crack had appeared at the corner of the glass, a jagged line running from the frame to the center of her reflection. But that was impossible. She hadn't touched it. Before she could think further, the sound of something scratching echoed in the walls. The noise was sharp, desperate, like fingers scraping against wood. It was the same sound she had heard the night before in the abandoned house, but this time it felt closer, more real. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the door, ready to leave, but the scratch grew louder, closer. She had to leave. The search for the source. Sarah stepped out into the cold morning air. her footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Ravenswood was quieter than usual, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The rain had stopped, but the fog still lingered, thick and cloying, rolling through the streets like a living thing. She made her way to the town center, passing the same weathered buildings, the same quiet faces. No one spoke to her, though she could feel their eyes on her as she walked past. The townspeople were too frightened to make eye contact, as if the very act of looking at her might summon something terrible. When she reached the local diner, she found it nearly empty, save for an elderly woman sitting at the counter, staring into her cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she sipped, but her eyes never left the steaming liquid. "Mind if I sit?" Sarah asked, her voice tentative. The woman looked up, her eyes widening for just a second before she nodded. "Suit yourself," she muttered, her voice low. Sarah sat down at the counter, taking in the room. It was quiet. Too quiet, save for the occasional clink of silverware or the sough of a fan overhead. She ordered coffee, her fingers tapping nervously on the counter as she waited. "Have you heard the stories?" the woman suddenly asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sarah leaned in. "What stories?" The woman glanced around, then spoke even lower, her words laced with fear. "Of the voices in the walls, the mirrors in the shadows." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "What do you mean?" she pressed. The woman's eyes darkened, and she leaned closer, her breath shaky. "There's a curse here, young one. It's been in Ravenswood for as long as anyone can remember, and it's waiting for you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Waiting for me?" she repeated. The woman nodded. "You've already seen it, haven't you? The shadows, the whispers, the signs. It's just beginning, but it will get worse." Sarah frowned. "What do I need to do?" The woman hesitated, her hands gripping her cup tightly. "I can't tell you, but you mustn't trust what you see in the mirrors. They show you things that aren't meant to be seen. And whatever you do, do not follow the whispers." A warning too late. Sarah paid for her coffee and left the diner, her mind racing. The woman's warning echoed in her ears. Do not follow the whispers. But she already had, hadn't she? She had already heard them, followed their call to the radio tower, and now, here she was, on the verge of uncovering something far darker than she had anticipated. She made her way to the town cemetery, the place where the old stories of Ravenswood had begun. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. A thick fog hung over the rows of gravestones, their names worn and fading, as though the memories of those buried there were slipping away with each passing year. As Sarah wandered deeper into the cemetery, she saw it. The large stone mausoleum at the far end, its doors cracked open. She had heard rumors about the place, whispers of strange happenings, of people going missing near the mausoleum, but she had never thought much of it, until now. The doorway, the moment she stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick with dust and decay, the stale smell of rot hanging in the air. It felt as if the past was pressing against her, suffocating her with its weight. Suddenly, she heard it again, the scratching sound. But this time, it wasn't just in the walls. It was everywhere. The noise echoed through the stone, reverberating against her skull. "Who's there?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. No answer, but the scratching continued. She turned toward the far corner of the mausoleum and saw something moving in the shadows. A shape, a figure, barely visible, standing motionless. And then, the voice again, the same voice in the radio tower, from the mirrors, from the shadows. "Come closer. It's waiting." The figure stepped forward, its face hidden in the darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time, she understood. This was no coincidence. This town was haunted by something ancient, something that had been waiting for her to arrive. Episode 4, The Shadow Behind the Veil. The unearthly silence. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, as Sarah stepped into the abandoned mausoleum. Her senses were heightened, every sound amplified. The crunch of her boots on the gravel, the rustling of the wind outside, and the distant, eerie hum that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. As she moved deeper into the mausoleum, The temperature dropped. She pulled her jacket tighter around her body, but it did little to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones. The oppressive silence made it difficult to think. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave the place before it claimed her as it had so many others. But she couldn't. The whispers had drawn her here, beckoning her to uncover the truth. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and for a moment, she thought she saw someone moving in the dark. Her heart skipped a beat as she swung the beam of light around, but there was nothing there, only the fading echoes of her own breath. Suddenly, the scratching sound began again, but this time it was louder, closer. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise came from behind the farthest door in the mausoleum. Her breath caught in her throat. She approached cautiously, her flashlight beam trembling in her hand. The door stood slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. Sarah's mind raced. She had come here looking for answers, but she wasn't sure she was prepared for what lay behind that door. Still, she couldn't turn back. Not now. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The heart of darkness. The room inside was small and claustrophobic, filled with rows of stone shelves lined with old, crumbling coffins. The smell of rotten decay was overwhelming, and Sarah fought the urge to gag. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deeply into the stone as though they had been carved by someone or something desperate to leave a message. At the far end of the room, a shadowy figure stood, just out of reach of her flashlight's beam. It was tall, its features blurred by the darkness, but she could feel its presence. It was watching her, waiting for her to approach. Her heart raced as the whispers grew louder in her ears. Come closer. The voice was soft, almost coaxing, but there was something about it that made Sarah's skin crawl. The more she tried to shake off the sensation, the stronger it became, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. It's waiting! The figure took a step forward, and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. It was as though the shadows themselves had taken form, like the room itself was coming alive. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold, unblinking, and filled with an unbearable hunger. As the figure stepped into the light, Sarah could make out a ragged cloak hanging from its shoulders. Its skin was pale, stretched tight across its bones, and its hands were long, gnarled, with sharp, bony fingers that seemed to twitch as it reached for her. You shouldn't have come here, Sarah. Her name. The voice spoke her name. How did it know? She had never given it. No one here had. You are already marked. The revelation. Suddenly, the air seemed to shift, and the figure stepped forward with unnatural speed. It reached out toward her, its fingers grazing her arm as though testing the waters. A cold, sharp chill passed through her body, and for a moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like she was staring into the eyes of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. The town is not what it seems. The voice hissed in her ear. Sarah's mind spun as the shadows closed in around her, and she stumbled backward, her hand landing on an old stone table that had been pushed against the wall. The room seemed to tilt, the walls shifting and warping as if they were alive, suffocating her with their presence. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed, unable to break free from the invisible grip that held her in place. Her heart pounded in her chest as the figure moved closer, its twisted form drawing nearer. You could not escape the shadows. The unseen enemy. The walls seemed to pulse as the whispers grew louder, their meaning lost in the distorted rhythm of the sound. The figure reached out again, its fingers inches from Sarah's face. She could feel the chill of its breath against her skin, could feel the pressure building in her chest, as if the air had turned solid and was crushing her from all sides. And then, just as the figure's fingers touched her skin, a blinding flash of light erupted from the center of the room, blinding her. The figure recoiled, its hands held up in front of its face, as if trying to shield itself from the light. No! The voice rasped, almost desperate. In that moment, Sarah was able to move. She stumbled backward, gasping for air as the room began to return to normal. The shadows retreated, and the figure was gone, lost once again in the darkness. But she could still hear it. The whispers. The call. You can't escape. You belong to us now. The door to the past. The light from Sarah's flashlight flickered as she caught her breath, her mind racing. What had just happened? What had that thing been? And why had it let her go? She turned to leave the mausoleum, but before she could reach the door, she saw something new. A doorway, hidden behind the stone shelves, half covered in dust and cobwebs. It had not been there before. It called to her, pulling her closer. Without thinking, Sarah stepped forward, her hand brushing the cool stone as she approached the hidden entrance. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway beyond. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. It was as if they were coming from the very walls themselves, beckoning her forward. Come to us. Come closer. She had no choice. She stepped into the darkness, the door closing behind her with a final, resounding thud. The hallway stretched on, a never-ending tunnel of shadow. But at the end, she could see something, a faint light flickering in the distance. Episode 5, The Unseen Hand. The deeper the darkness. Sarah had barely slept. The dreams returned that night, worse than before. In her nightmares, the shadows were no longer just a whisper in the dark. They were alive, crawling over her skin, wrapping around her neck, pulling her deeper into the earth. She had barely escaped the mausoleum, barely managed to escape the suffocating darkness that had nearly consumed her. But now, with each passing hour, it felt as though the darkness was following her, like an invisible hand trailing just behind her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The town of Ravenswood had a heavy presence, but it wasn't the town that was haunted. It was the very land beneath it. It was the air itself. The cold that settled into her bones was not just a chill of winter. It was a chill of something ancient, something that had never truly left. The walls of the abandoned house were still imprinted on her mind, their whispers haunting her every waking moment. And the tower, the radio tower, stood looming in the distance, as if beckoning her to return, calling her to uncover its secrets. The tower had seen things. It had heard things. And now, she needed to know what it had to say. The tower beckons. Anna stood at the edge of the town, staring out at the tower. It was as imposing as ever, towering over the landscape like some forsaken monument, a symbol of the town's darkest secrets. The wind had picked up, whipping around her in icy gusts that sent a chill through her spine. Her mind raced as she took the first step toward the tower. She could feel its pull, like a magnet drawing her closer. She had no choice. The voice, the whispers, they had been growing louder with each passing day. The more she ignored them, the more they became insistent, demanding that she listen. There was no escaping it. The darkness had marked her. She was already tied to Ravenswood, to its cursed past, its forgotten memories, an uneasy silence. As Anna moved closer to the tower, the town seemed to fall away. It was like crossing into another world, a place where time didn't matter, where the sun refused to shine. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made every step feel like it was echoing through eternity. The only sound that could be heard was the creaking of the tower, the slow, rhythmic groan of metal stretching and bending under the weight of time. The higher she climbed, the more the tower seemed to pulse, its rhythm matching the thumping of her heart. She reached the top, her breath shallow, her hands trembling. The view from here was terrifying, a barren landscape that stretched on forever, a ghostly sea of trees and fog. And then she heard it again, the whispers. They were no longer just in her mind. They were all around her. You shouldn't have come. The first unseen hand. Before Anna could react, a cold gust of wind swept through the tower. She reached for the railing, but her hand grasped only air. A sudden pressure gripped her chest, pushing her backward. She tried to regain her balance, but the pressure increased, as though invisible hands were pushing against her, forcing her to the edge of the tower. She gasped for breath, the world spinning as she fought to stay upright. Panic surged through her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see clearly, couldn't think. The pressure continued to mount. Her body felt as though it were being torn apart. The whispers swirled around her, louder now, more intense, like an army of voices, all chanting the same thing. Come to us. You are one of us. Her vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness beginning to fade. She tried to scream, but the sound was drowned out by the cacophony of whispers that filled her mind. Suddenly, everything went silent. The pressure lifted, and Anna collapsed onto the cold, damp ground of the tower's platform. She lay there, gasping for air, her heart racing, her body trembling. The fallen ones. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, the tower seemed to be watching her. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper. As Anna stumbled to her feet, she noticed something she hadn't before, a series of runes carved into the stone floor beneath her. They were faint, barely visible, as if the very ground had been scarred by something ancient, something that had been buried for generations. The runes were unsettling, their shapes unfamiliar, their meanings lost in the dust of time. But as she studied them, Anna felt the unmistakable sensation that they were alive and watching her. The wind picked up again, swirling through the open gaps in the tower. But this time, it wasn't the usual breeze. This was something colder, sharper, more tangible. Anna reached down, her fingers brushing the runes. As her skin made contact, she felt a jolt, like an electric shock, running through her. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming. Almost like the ground beneath her had come alive, pulsing with ancient power. And then, as quickly as it had come, the sensation vanished. But the whispers didn't stop. The silent pact. The tower groaned again, and this time it was accompanied by a faint rattle from deep within the structure. Anna's mind raced, thoughts jumbled, heart thudding in her chest. She could feel the presence of something in the air, something waiting, something watching. Before she could make sense of it, the whispers returned, this time more insistent, more desperate. The pact has been made. It was the first time Anna had heard the whispers speak of a pact. What did it mean? What pact? And who had made it? She could feel her mind unraveling, the questions piling up faster than she could process. The air around her felt charged, electric. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to leave, but she couldn't tear herself away. She was bound to this place, just as the whispers had said. The tower had chosen her. The last call. As Anna turned to leave, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the tower groaned louder than before. The whispers intensified, growing into a deafening roar, like 1,000 voices crying out in agony. The air grew thick with dread, and the world seemed to close in around her. But then, she heard something else. "You are the last." The voice was different this time. It wasn't a whisper. It was commanding, deep, full of power. Anna's heart skipped a beat as she turned to face the source of the voice. A figure, barely visible in the shadows of the tower, emerged. It was tall, its form shrouded in darkness, its face hidden by a hooded cloak. But Anna could feel its presence, feel the weight of its gaze upon her. The figure spoke again, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You've awakened us, and now you will serve us." Episode 6. The Whispering Wounds. The haunting past. Anna could feel the weight of the ancient town pressing down on her every time she walked through the streets. Ravenswood wasn't just haunted in the supernatural sense. It was haunted by its past, its forgotten sins, and the shadows that still lingered long after the inhabitants had turned to dust. The air was always thick here, as if the fog itself carried whispers from the grave, murmuring secrets meant for no one but the earth beneath her feet. The things she had seen, the things that had called to her from the darkness, had left her shaken, but they had also given her purpose. She needed answers, answers that had eluded generations before her. The whispers had only grown louder in the past few days, ever since she had uncovered the hidden door at the mausoleum and the strange runes etched into the tower's walls. The shadows had followed her everywhere, at night, in her dreams, and even in the silence of the day. The town was alive with secrets. And those secrets were coming for her. A mother's warning. It was early morning when Anna decided to visit the only person who might have answers. Her grandmother, who had lived in Ravenswood her entire life. Sarah's warnings had only grown more cryptic with time. The old woman had told Anna stories of Ravenswood. Stories of a time when the town was thriving, before it was cursed. Anna had heard the stories of the curse before, of course. Every child in Ravenswood grew up hearing them. But it wasn't until recently that she began to question them. There had to be something more. Her grandmother had always seemed to know something more, but she had never spoken about it until now. Sarah's house was on the outskirts of town, nestled in the hollow of the forest. The smell of burning would fill the air as Anna approached, a familiar scent that seemed to ground her in the midst of the confusion swirling in her mind. Her grandmother had always been a woman of few words, but her eyes, they spoke volumes. As Anna walked up the front steps, the door creaked open before she could knock. There stood Sarah, her wrinkled face a mix of concern and something darker, something that Anna couldn't quite place. "You've been hearing it too, haven't you?" Sarah's voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was a heavy certainty behind her words. Anna nodded, her throat tight. The whispers, the shadows. Sarah stepped aside, ushering Anna into the dimly lit house. The air was thick inside, the smell of herbs and old wood mixing in a way that made Anna feel as though she were walking through a time forgotten by the world. "Sit, child," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We need to talk." Anna sat at the small table, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the wooden surface. Her grandmother moved silently around the room, gathering a few items, dried herbs, a small bowl of water, and a bundle of candles. She set the items down in front of Anna and sat across from her, her eyes heavy with years of knowledge. "I know what you're searching for," Sarah began, her voice low. "The town's curse, the shadows, the whispers. It's all connected, Anna. And you walked into something far darker than you realize. The heart of the curse." Anna leaned forward, her heart racing. "What do you mean? Why is this happening to me?" Sarah's eyes softened, but they were filled with sadness. Ravenswood was never just a town. It was a gateway, a doorway between worlds, and the curse that binds it was born from a ritual gone wrong long ago. A pact made with something ancient, something that now lives in the shadows. She paused, taking a deep breath. When the pact was broken, the darkness was released, and it's been feeding on the souls of Ravenswood ever since. It waits for the right time to cross over completely. And now, Anna, you are the one who has opened the door again. Anna felt a chill race through her veins. She had opened the door. She had unknowingly become the key to whatever ancient power had once been locked away. The weight of it felt suffocating. But why me? Why am I connected to this? Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "Because your bloodline is part of the curse," Sarah explained, her voice filled with a sorrow that made Anna's heart ache. "Your mother, she tried to escape. She ran from this town, thinking she could leave it all behind. But the shadows followed her. They followed her all the way to the end, and now they've come for you." Anna's eyes widened, the realization sinking in. "My mother..." Sarah nodded. "She wasn't the only one. There are others, too. People like you, born into this town, tied to its history. They were marked the moment they took their first breath here. But you, Anna, you are different. You've seen it. You've heard the whispers. The shadows have chosen you. And now you must face what's coming. The dark secrets of Ravenswood." The room fell silent as Anna tried to process the truth of her grandmother's words. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her. But there was more, something deeper, something even darker than the whispers. "Where do I begin?" Anna asked, barely able to speak. Sarah looked into her granddaughter's eyes, a deep sadness lingering in her gaze. "You must go to the old church, deep in the woods. There, you'll find the answers, and you'll be able to confront the darkness that has plagued Ravenswood for generations." Anna stood, her legs shaky beneath her. The fog had thickened outside, wrapping the town in a blanket of mystery. The shadows that followed her were growing stronger with each passing day, and she knew, deep down, that she had to face whatever waited for her in the woods. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind as she stepped toward the door. "The shadows are not just in the town. They are in you, Anna, and only by facing them will you break the curse." Episode 7, The Final Hour, The Cold Hand of Fate. Anna had never felt the weight of time as acutely as she did now. The old clock tower, standing tall and forgotten in the heart of Ravenswood, had begun to toll again. Its deep, resonating chimes had been silent for years, and yet, just days ago, they started again, each hour heavier than the last, as though the town itself had awoken from a long, terrible sleep. Her grandmother's warnings echoed in her ears, and though she could still feel the sharp sting of her words, something inside Anna refused to believe the depths of the horror that awaited her. That was before the shadows started following her, lurking just out of reach, whispering dreadful promises of what was to come. Now, as she walked through the thick, fog-choked streets of the town, each step felt like it echoed in the void, like everything had shifted, and she was a part of something much darker than she could understand. The veil had been lifted, and what lay beyond was no longer a mystery. The unseen enemy. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had become louder, more urgent. They followed her, seeping into her mind when she slept, echoing like a constant hum at the edge of her hearing when she was awake. The voices were calling to her, pleading for her to understand. Tonight, though, something had changed. The thick mist that had hung over the town for the past week had grown heavier, moving with unnatural ease through the streets, pushing past buildings and creeping into cracks of homes like a living thing. The sun had set hours ago, and the moon was barely a sliver in the sky, hidden behind clouds that seemed to gather unnaturally fast. As Anna approached the old church on the outskirts of town, she felt the strange weight of her decision. She had to go inside. She had to uncover the truth. The journey that had started with curiosity had now spiraled into something far more sinister. The deeper she delved into Ravenswood's past, the more entwined she became with the town's cursed fate. But there was something waiting for her. She could feel it in the very air, as if the town itself had grown hostile toward her presence. The whispers had taken on a new tone, violent, demanding, as though whatever had been slumbering beneath Ravenswood's surface was starting to stir, to awaken, and now it was calling for her. Anna's breath quickened, and she broke into a run, her boots splashing in the wet streets, the sensation of something watching her growing stronger with every step. She had to reach the church before it was too late. The Church of Lost Souls. The church stood like a dark sentinel in the mist, its Gothic architecture looming over the town like a creature waiting to devour all who dared approach. Anna's eyes were fixed on the tall wooden doors, which had been weathered with age, their once bright paint now chipped and worn. The air around her was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. There was no sound but the beating of her heart, echoing in her ears as she reached for the handle. The door creaked open as if welcoming her in, though she knew better than to believe it was an invitation. She stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop as she entered the abandoned sanctuary. The heavy air in the church weighed on her chest, as though it, too, was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The inside of the church was bathed in an eerie, dim light, the faint glow of candles flickering on altars long abandoned. The walls were lined with stained glass windows that had long since shattered, and the pews were covered in dust, untouched for what seemed like an eternity. But in the center of the room, there was something new, a shadow. It moved across the floor like a living thing, its form shifting and twisting in the dim light. Anna's pulse raced, and her feet moved on their own accord, carrying her toward the darkened altar. The shadow seemed to have no source, no clear form, but was there, waiting for her to come closer. The closer she stepped, the colder the air became, the darkness thickening with each passing second. The unforgiven. As she stood before the altar, the shadow began to take shape. It was no longer a formless mass. It began to assume the shape of a figure, but one that was grotesque and misshapen. Its body was tall, thin, and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long and sinewy. Its face was a blur, as though it had no features at all. But its eyes, those eyes, they burned with an ancient, terrible hunger. Anna's blood ran cold as the creature turned its gaze toward her, and for a moment, she was paralyzed. The whispers had fallen silent, replaced by a suffocating, oppressive presence. This thing, whatever it was no longer just part of the town. It was part of her fate. "You've come, finally." The voice was not human, but a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the air, sending shivers down Anna's spine. She could feel her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice shaking with fear. The creature tilted its head, and its eyes seemed to pierce through her very soul. "You've unlocked the door. The pact is broken. The time has come. Before Anna could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The walls shook, and the air was filled with a deafening sound of cracking stone. The shadowed figure stretched its arms toward her, its long fingers curling like claws. "It is too late to turn back." The word sent a chill through her body, and for the first time since she had arrived in Ravenswood, Anna realized just how deep the darkness had taken root. She had been marked, not only by the town, but by the very entity that had existed beneath it all. And there was no escaping it now. The descent begins. Suddenly, the ground cracked open beneath her feet, and a blinding light shot up from the depths. The altar crumbled, revealing a hidden passageway leading downward into the heart of the earth. Anna didn't think. She couldn't. Her legs carried her forward, driven by an unknown force, deeper into the bowels of the earth, into the heart of the curse. But with every step she took, the shadows grew stronger, the whispers louder. She could feel the weight of them pressing on her, their voices becoming more frantic, more desperate. As she descended, she understood this was just a beginning. The secrets she had uncovered were nothing compared to what lay ahead. And now, the darkness had found her. The veil between worlds was thin, and it was only a matter of time before the shadows consumed everything. Episode 8. Echoes of the Forgotten, the return to the abyss. The night had fallen heavy over Ravenswood, and for Anna, it felt like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something. She had felt it for weeks, an unsettling silence that seemed to linger at the edges of her consciousness, a constant hum beneath the surface. Every time she closed her eyes, the whispers would return, more insistent, more desperate, calling her toward the tower, calling her towards something she couldn't fully understand. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she was going to face whatever it was that had been chasing her. The shadows had made their presence known over the last few days, and Anna knew that the time had come to confront the truth of Ravenswood, the truth that had been buried deep within its cursed history. As she stood before the old tower, its silhouette looming against the starless sky, Anna felt a strange calm settle over her. The wind howled around her, but she felt no fear. She had faced too much already. Now, there was only the certainty of the path ahead. She had to know the truth, the tower's secrets. The doors of the tower creaked as Anna pushed them open, the air inside cool and damp. The ground beneath her feet was slick with moss, and the smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. The tower had been abandoned for years, yet tonight it felt alive. The walls seemed to whisper her name, the stones of the tower groaning under the weight of the secret they held. Anna hesitated, her hand resting on the cold, rusted doorknob. The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening. They were calling her, urging her to step inside. She could feel the weight of their call. Something deep inside her telling her she was close, that the answers were just within reach. Taking a deep breath, Anna stepped inside. The chamber was vast, the air thick with the scent of decay. Old wooden beams crisscrossed above her head, and the walls were lined with ancient books, their pages yellowed with age. At the far end of the room, there was a large stone altar, and around it, faint markings glowed with an eerie, ethereal light. Anna walked toward the altar, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust beneath her. The whispers had quieted, replaced by a heavy silence, as if the tower itself were waiting for her to make the next move. Her eyes fell on the markings etched into the altar, their shapes intricate and deliberate, symbols she had never seen before, but somehow they felt familiar, as if they were calling to her, pulling her closer to the truth, the pact. As she examined the markings, Anna's heart began to race. The symbols were not just random shapes. They were part of a larger ritual, a ritual that had been performed long ago, before Ravenswood had fallen into ruin. It was a pact, a binding agreement made with forces that were not meant to be disturbed. The air around her shifted, and for a moment, she felt as though the very walls were closing in on her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could hear her heart pounding in her ears. The whispers were back, louder than ever, swirling around her like a storm. "You have come too far." The voice was low and distorted, not of this world. Anna's eyes snapped to the altar, where a dark figure had emerged from the shadows. Its form was indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel the weight of its gaze on her, its power radiating through the air. The pact has already been made. There is no turning back now. Anna's legs shook, but she forced herself to remain standing. The figure before her seemed to shimmer, like smoke caught in a windstorm. The air grew colder, the darkness thickening around her. She could barely make out the figure's face. But its eyes, those eyes, they glowed with an unnatural light, an evil she had never known. "Who are you?" Anna demanded, her voice trembling but determined. The figure's lips curled into a smile, though it was no smile of warmth or comfort. It was a smile of something ancient, something that had seen eons pass and had only grown stronger with each passing year. "I am the one who watches, the one who waits. And you, Anna, have awakened something that should never have been stirred." The unveiling. Anna felt her heart race in her chest as the figure began to move toward her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground, her body unable to move. The figure stepped closer, and with each step, the temperature in the room dropped, the shadows growing deeper, colder. "You think you can escape the past?" the figure hissed, its voice low and filled with malice. "The darkness has already claimed you, Anna. You are nothing but a vessel now, a pawn in a game that has been played for centuries." Suddenly, Anna felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if something had pierced her heart. She gasped, her hands clutching her chest as she fell to her knees, gasping for air. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, deafening in their intensity. It was as if the very walls of the tower were pressing in on her, suffocating her. "The darkness is inside you now." The figure's voice was a low whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves. "And soon you will understand what it means to be part of this world." Anna's vision blurred, her body shaking as she fought to stay conscious. The pain was unbearable, but through it all, she felt a strange sense of clarity, a realization that she had crossed a line, one for which there was no return. The shadows had claimed her, just as they had claimed so many others before her. And now, the pact was complete. The reckoning. As Anna's vision began to fade, she saw a flash of light, a blinding, intense light that enveloped the room. It was the light of something powerful, something ancient. The shadows recoiled, and the figure before her hissed in anger, its form writhing in the light. "No!" the figure whispered, its voice trembling with fear. "You cannot escape. The pact is already sealed." But Anna was no longer listening. The light was her only focus now, the only thing that could save her from the darkness that had consumed her. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and as her hand touched the light, a wave of energy surged through her, washing away the darkness. The figure screamed, but it was too late. The light consumed it, and with one final cry, the figure vanished into the ether. Episode 9. Into the Abyss. The descent begins. The air in Ravenswood had become thick, suffocating with the weight of ancient secrets. Each breath Anna took pulling her further into the inevitable truth. She could feel the town closing in around her, its shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The whispers had stopped altogether, leaving only silence, a silence so deafening it filled her ears, echoed in her thoughts. She had crossed the threshold. There was no going back now. As Anna stood before the gaping chasm in the ground, the remnants of what had once been the church, now a twisted, ruined structure, she felt a tremor run through her body. The sky above had turned a sickly shade of purple, as if the very heavens themselves were watching her every move. The earth beneath her feet hummed with a deep, rumbling vibration, the kind of sound that seemed to originate from the core of the world itself. A dark, yawning hole lay before her, its edges jagged, like the mouth of some ravenous creature waiting to devour her. The abyss. She had been warned about it. Her grandmother's cryptic words echoing in her mind. "Do not go into the abyss, Anna. For once you do, we will not let you leave." But here she was, standing at its edge, staring into the dark unknown. The gate opens. Anna swallowed hard, her throat dry. The ground beneath her had started to crack, and the tremors grew stronger. The abyss was not just a hole in the earth. It was a gateway, a tear between worlds, between the living and the dead. The darkness that had plagued Ravenswood for centuries had been hiding in plain sight, deep beneath the surface. It was only now, with Anna's footsteps echoing into the depths, that it began to stir. The shadows, the whispers, everything had led to this moment. She could feel the pull of it, the compulsion to step forward, to descend into the unknown. But something inside her hesitated. Something in the back of her mind screamed for her to stop. Not yet. It's not time. But her feet were already moving. One step forward, then another. The stones beneath her crumbled as she walked, as if the earth itself was unwilling to hold her up. Yet, despite the foreboding sense of doom, Anna kept moving forward, the descent into madness. With each step, the light grew fainter, swallowed by the inky blackness that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The air grew colder, each breath now leaving her lungs in a fog of ice. The deeper she went, the more her senses dulled. Sounds became muffled, colors faded, and the weight of the blackness pressing on her from all sides. It was then she heard it, a low, guttural hum. The sound seemed to vibrate through her very bones, as though the earth itself was speaking. She froze, the cold seeping into her very soul. "Who are you?" Anna whispered into the void, her voice trembling. The shadows seemed to shift, swirling around her like a living, breathing entity. The hum grew louder, and then, in the dead silence that followed, a voice, deep, distorted, otherworldly, spoke. "You have come." The words sent a jolt of fear through Anna's spine, and she spun around, but the shadows offered no answers. There was nothing but the endless, oppressive darkness. "We've been waiting for you." A cold chill ran down Anna's back as the voice echoed in her mind. Who was waiting for her? The revelations. Anna's hand shook as she took another step deeper into the abyss, the ground crumbling beneath her feet. The darkness ahead seemed to pulse, as if the very air around her was alive. Her heart beat faster as she reached the center of the cavern, the eerie silence returning once again. This was it, the heart of the curse, the source of everything that had happened to Ravenswood. And then, the truth began to surface. The walls of the cavern began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, casting long, haunting shadows on the jagged stone. It was not firelight, not candlelight. It was something else, something far older and more terrifying. As the light flickered, the symbols from the old church appeared on the walls, glowing faintly. They were familiar, yet alien, each one representing something dark, something forgotten. As Anna's eyes traced the symbols, they began to form words, the language incomprehensible, but the meaning was clear. The abyss had always been here, its roots stretching deep into the earth, its power flowing through every part of Ravenswood. The pact that had been made all those years ago, the pact that had cursed the town, it wasn't just about the shadows. It was about control, about binding the souls of Ravenswood to the dark force that had slumbered beneath it. Anna had been brought here for a reason. The voice from earlier returned, this time softer, but more insistent, echoing in her mind. "You are the key." Anna's heart raced as she realized the truth. She had always been a part of this story. The bloodline that had once been tied to the pact, the very essence of Ravenswood's curse. She had been marked long before she had ever set foot in the town. The reckoning. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath her, the walls of the abyss opening wider. The shadows, once distant, closing around her, enveloping her. The whispers returned, louder than ever, clawing at her mind, demanding that she join them. Anna's heart thundered in her chest as a force beyond her control dragged her closer to the edge of the abyss. She tried to fight back, but the shadows gripped her, pulling her toward the darkness. "You are the one we have been waiting for. Come, embrace your destiny." With one final, desperate breath, Anna leaped into the void, plunging into the unknown. Episode 10. Whispers from the Depths. The fractured realization. The world as Anna had known it was gone. The abyss beneath Ravenswood had claimed everything. Its grip was unyielding, and the shadows that had been closing in on her since the very beginning were now thick and suffocating, pulsing with dark energy. The once peaceful town, its quaint streets now swallowed by an eerie fog, was just a beginning. What lay beneath was a truth far more sinister, one that she could no longer escape, no matter how hard she tried. But even in the heart of darkness, she could still hear them. The whispers. They came to her as she lay in the cold, hollow stone chamber deep beneath Ravenswood. It was the heart of the curse, the place where everything began, where the pacts were made, and where the veil between worlds was thinnest. Anna had been pulled here, unwillingly, like a moth to flame, and the more she struggled, the more she realized she was no longer in control. The whispers were guiding her, beckoning her deeper into the void. But Anna wasn't sure if they were helping her, or condemning her to something far worse. The awakening. Anna's eyes flickered open, her surroundings dark, but strangely alive with faint, otherworldly glow. The walls of the cavern pulsed with ancient energy, the veins of stone tracing glowing symbols, the same symbols she had seen before. The markings now burned bright with fevered intensity, their forms shifting as if they were alive, watching her. She shuddered, trying to push the fear down. She had faced the shadows before, had confronted the unknown, but something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if the entire world around her had shifted, like the very fabric of reality had begun to tear. She stood shakily, trying to steady her breath as the air around her grew colder. Her eyes darted around the chamber, but she saw no one. Only the symbols, only the darkness. Yet, she wasn't alone. She could feel it. Something watching her. Something far older than the town of Ravenswood. Something that had been waiting for her. The whispers began again, soft at first, like a caress. They called her name, pulling at her soul, urging her to approach. Come closer. The truth awaits. The voice slithered into her mind like a snake. The choice. Anna hesitated. She wanted to turn and run, to escape the suffocating presence of the shadows that seemed to close in on her with every passing second. But she couldn't. Not anymore. She had crossed too many lines, uncovered too many secrets, and now there was no escape. There was only one path left, the one that led deeper into the abyss. Her eyes lingered on the stone altar at the center of the chamber. It was massive, carved with symbols she could barely comprehend, and yet they burned with an undeniable urgency. She had seen these before, on the walls of the old church, on the altar that had been desecrated by the shadows. They were the keys, the final piece of the puzzle she had been trying to solve. The whispers became louder, more insistent. She felt herself drawn toward the altar, as if her feet were no longer her own. With each step, the weight of the darkness grew heavier, suffocating her. The voice spoke again, and this time, Anna could hear the power in its tone, the threat. You have come too far. There's no turning back. She reached the altar, her hands trembling as she touched the stone. The moment her skin made contact, a flash of blinding light filled her vision. The ground trembled beneath her, and the shadows twisted, reshaping themselves into figures. Figures she recognized, faces from her past. The people she had lost, the ones she had never forgotten, now standing before her in the flesh. But they weren't the same. Their eyes glowed with sickly light, their forms twisted and malformed. They moved toward her, reaching for her, their hands cold and pale. Help us, Anna. The curse will never end unless you. But Anna couldn't finish hearing them. The energy that had been building in the chamber was overwhelming, and she could feel herself slipping away, her vision blurring as her mind began to unravel. The truth revealed. Suddenly, there was a shift. The air around her grew thick, heavy with power. The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, and she saw the truth, the terrible truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The shadows, the whispers, the cursed town of Ravenswood. It was all part of a greater plan, a plan she had unknowingly become a part of. The pact, the one her ancestors had made, had bound them to the darkness. Ravenswood had been built on the ashes of that pact, and the souls of the town had been enslaved to the darkness that lay beneath. Every generation had served the curse, but it was always meant to be completed by her. Anna had been chosen, whether she knew it or not. The bloodline that ran through her veins had always been the key to breaking or continuing the pact. And now, she had to make a choice. The shadows whispered again, their voices becoming clearer, more distinct, pressing on her mind. You are the key, Anna. Choose. Break the curse or seal it forever. The descent into darkness. Anna's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced, the weight of the decision crashing down on her. Break the curse, or allow it to continue. The choice was hers, but the consequences were beyond anything she could fathom. The darkness pressing closer, and she realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that there was no way to escape. The abyss had already claimed her. With one final breath, Anna placed her hands on the altar and made her choice. Episode 11, The Final Reckoning. The Awakening. The world was silent. Anna felt the weight of it pressing down on her, the stillness that had replaced the whispers. The air was thick with a sense of finality, as though the fabric of time itself had stopped moving. She stood in the middle of the ruined altar chamber, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The energy that had filled the space only moments ago now felt like a distant memory. The abyss had grown quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Anna was no longer sure of her surroundings. The once vibrant symbols carved into the walls had faded, as if the magic had been drained from them, and the oppressive shadows that had consumed Ravenswood had receded, leaving an unsettling emptiness in their place. But something was wrong. Anna felt it deep within her bones. The stillness wasn't peace. It was suspense, a fragile silence that marked the calm before the storm. Something was coming. The shadows were not gone. They had merely been waiting. Her thoughts swirled like the darkness around her. She had made a choice. She had sealed Ravenswood's fate. But at what cost? The betrayal. As the moments passed, Anna's mind began to clear, she took a step forward, feeling the crunch of old stone beneath her boots. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, but there was something else, a faint, lingering smell. Rotting wood, like the scent of forgotten memories and broken promises. It wasn't just the town that had been corrupted. It was the land itself. Ravenswood had been built on blood, on secrets that had been buried for generations. And now, those secrets were beginning to surface. She turned toward the altar, the place where it all began. The stone seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic energy. It was as though the abyss itself was breathing, waiting for her to take the next step. Anna knew that she couldn't run from the truth anymore. She had never been able to escape it. The shadows had followed her from the moment she set foot in this cursed town. The pact, the one that had bound her bloodline to the forces of darkness, was hers to fulfill. Whether she liked it or not, she was the key. But the truth was more than just a curse. It was a betrayal. For the first time, Anna understood the depths of her family's involvement in this twisted cycle. She had thought that her ancestors had made the pact out of desperation, out of fear. But she was wrong. They had made it willingly, knowingly, for power. And she, Anna, was their legacy. The power of the abyss was hers to command, or to be consumed by. The cold truth settled in her chest like a stone. She wasn't just a victim of the curse. She was its vessel, the shadow's truth. Anna's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement in the shadows. For a moment, she froze, her heart racing. But as the figure stepped into the dim light, she realized that it wasn't a new threat. It was a figure she had seen before. The shadowed figure from her visions, the one that had been haunting her dreams, now stood before her. Its face was obscured by a mask of darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was neither human nor fully inhuman, a distorted figure that seemed to float between realms. "You have chosen, Anna." The voice was deep, resonant, filled with a power that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't the voice of the shadow. It was something far older, far more ancient. "The price is now yours to pay." Anna stepped back, her pulse quickening. She had always known this moment would come. The moment when the truth about the pact would be revealed, when the shadows would claim their prize. But she had made her choice. She had sealed Ravenswood's fate, and now there was no going back. The figure tilted its head, as if studying her reaction. "You did not understand the cost of your choice, did you?" it asked, its voice a low whisper that seemed to vibrate in the air around her. Anna swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What do you mean?" The pact was never about the town or the people. The figure's voice became more intense, its tone almost mocking. "It was about you, Anna. You are the one who will carry this burden, the one who will keep the abyss alive." The final test. Anna shook her head, the realization crashing down on her like a wave. She had never wanted this. She had never asked for this power, this curse. And yet, she had become its unwilling vessel. The figure took a step closer, its form shifting with each movement, its presence overwhelming. The abyss feeds on those who seek power, those who think they can control it. It raised its hand, and Anna felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. And now you will learn just how deep the darkness runs. The shadows gathered around her, forming a swirling vortex of dark energy. The air grew colder, and Anna's heart raced as the weight of the abyss pressing on her from all sides. She could hear the whispers again, louder than before, their voices blending into a cacophony of madness. You are the key. You are the one who will unlock the door to eternal darkness. Anna's vision blurred, the pressure in her chest becoming unbearable. She fought against it, struggling to maintain control, to keep her mind intact. She had come too far, endured too much, to let the darkness win now. But the figure was right. She was the key. The shadows closed in around her, and she was pulled into the vortex, consumed by the abyss. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure's face, its eyes glowing in ancient fire, watching her as she was swallowed whole. Episode 12. The Shattering. The Broken Truth. The morning light was a cruel thing, breaking to fog with a pale, distant gleam, but it brought no warmth. Anna stood in the center of what had once been the heart of Ravenswood, the ruins of the church now just a hollow shell of shattered walls and broken stones. The world around her felt out of place, as if reality itself was starting to come apart at the seams. Anna could feel it, like a shift in the air, an unsettling vibration deep within her bones. The darkness had been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It had been patient, gathering strength in the corners of the town, and the shadows had been stalking her for so long. And now it was here. She stared into the distance, where the last remnants of the cursed fog clung to the ground like a thick, suffocating veil. The winds were silent, and the town felt empty. But she knew the truth now. The curse was not over. It had never been. She had thought she could break it, thought she could free herself from its grip. But the abyss had different plans. The calling. The whispers were louder now, a constant presence in the back of her mind, calling her name, urging her toward the inevitable. They had grown stronger in the days since her last encounter with the figure beneath the church. That dark entity had revealed the truth to her, the truth about her role in the curse, about her bloodline's connection to the abyss. She wasn't just a victim. She was the key. You can't escape your fate, Anna. The voice echoed in her mind, almost like a chant. It was no longer just one voice, but many, all merging together into an overwhelming chorus. You have already been marked. There is no turning back. Anna clenched her fists, fighting back the rising tide of dread that threatened to consume her. The words from the figure beneath the church haunted her, their truth undeniable. She had crossed a line. The moment she stepped into Ravenswood, her fate had been sealed. Her feet carried her forward against her will. There was no denying the pull of the abyss, the magnetic force drawing her in. She didn't want to go, didn't want to face what lay ahead, but she had no choice. The shadows were coming for her, and there was no way to hide. The veil cracks. She moved deeper into the ruins, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence of the once sacred space. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching out to her like grasping hands. The ruins were more than just a place. They were a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The very ground beneath her was tainted with blood, the echoes of the past, the remnants of those who had made the pact with the darkness long ago. But it wasn't just the shadows that haunted her. It was the truth, the realization that she was trapped, that the curse had been set in motion long before she had ever come to Ravenswood. As she reached the altar, the heart of it all, she paused. The symbols on the stone surface were glowing once more, faint but unmistakable. She could feel their power pulsing in the air, a force that called to her, urging her to step closer. But something else was there, something new, a presence that had never been before, something darker than anything she had encountered up to now. She could feel its eyes on her, cold and empty. And in that moment, Anna knew the abyss wasn't waiting anymore. It had found her, the descent into madness. Before Anna could react, the ground beneath her cracked, a deep rumbling shaking the entire room. The air thickened, heavy with a suffocating presence that pushed against her chest. She tried to move, to escape, but her legs were frozen, her body paralyzed by fear. "It is time, Anna," the voice whispered, its presence surrounding her from all sides. "The darkness has been waiting for you, and now you'll understand its true power." Suddenly, the walls began to close in, the cracks spreading like veins through the very foundation of the church. The light from the symbols intensified, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. Anna gasped, her breath caught in her throat. The room had shifted, or rather, her perception of it had. The church was no longer just a decaying ruin. It was something far worse, a gateway, a threshold between the living and the dead. And now, Anna had stepped over it. The whispers reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices, overlapping, blending into one indistinguishable sound that drove her mad. Her pulse quickened as the shadows swirled around her, taking form, becoming something more. The figure, the one that had haunted her from the beginning, stepped out of the darkness. It was no longer just a distorted shape. It was real now, its presence filling the room, its eyes glow in otherworldly light. "You have come so far, Anna. You think you can stop this? You cannot. You are already part of it." The figure moved closer, and Anna instinctively took a step back, but the shadows around her moved, pushing her forward. There was no escape, no way out. The figure loomed over her, its form impossibly tall, its hands outstretched as if to welcome her into the abyss itself. Welcome home. The final decision. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Anna could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the inevitability of her fate settling like a lead weight in her chest. She had come here for answers, to end the curse that had plagued Ravenswood for centuries. But now she understood. There was no ending. There was no salvation. The figure's hands reached for her, its cold touch sending a shock through her body. It was no longer a question of whether she could escape. It was about whether she would be consumed by it. She was the key, the one who would either seal or break the pact that kept the abyss alive for generations. Choose, Anna. The choice was hers.